The sound of her own breathing seemed louder than the cattle's restless shifting, as Elena Foster pressed herself against the rough wooden slats of the train car, praying the darkness would swallow her whole. She had been running for 3 days straight. Ever since she'd escaped from the man her uncle had sold her to like a piece of livestock. And now, in September of 1882, hidden among the lowing beasts being transported from Omaha to the stockyards further west, she finally allowed herself to believe she might actually survive this. The train lurched forward with a metallic groan that echoed through the valley, and Elena gripped the wooden beam beside her to keep from falling into the press of cattle. Her dress, once a respectable blue calico, was now torn at the hem and stained with mud and worse. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins hours ago, hanging in tangled waves down her back. She was 21 years old, and until 3 days ago, she had believed her Uncle Theodore had her best interests at heart when he'd taken her in after her parents died of fever the previous winter. She'd been wrong. Terribly, devastatingly wrong. The man he'd promised her to, a wealthy rancher named Silas Garrett from Kansas, was 47 years old with eyes like chips of ice and hands that had gripped her arms hard enough to leave bruises when he'd tried to kiss her at their first meeting. Her uncle had already taken Garrett's money. The wedding was supposed to have happened 2 days ago. Instead, Elena had climbed out her bedroom window in the dead of night, stolen her uncle's emergency cash from the tin box under his bed, and run. She'd made it to the train yards before dawn, sneaking onto this cattle car just as the workers were loading the last of the livestock. She'd been hungry, terrified, and desperate. She still was, but at least now she was moving away from that life, away from Silas Garrett and his cold eyes and cruel hands. The cattle shifted around her, their warm bodies providing some comfort in the chilly autumn night. Elena had wedged herself into a corner near the front of the car, where a broken slat gave her just enough air to breathe without choking on the heavy smell of the animals. She'd been living on the hard biscuits she'd bought at a station when the train had stopped briefly that afternoon, sneaking out just long enough to spend a few precious coins before scrambling back into hiding. She must have dozed off despite her fear, because the next thing she knew, bright morning sunlight was streaming through the slats, and the train was slowing down. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she peered through a gap in the wood. They were pulling into some kind of station or depot. She could see buildings in the distance and mountains rising beyond them, their peaks already dusted with early snow. The train came to a complete stop with a final shudder, and Elena heard voices shouting outside. Men's voices, calling instructions to each other. The cattle began to stir more restlessly, sensing the change. Elena pressed herself harder against the corner, trying to make herself invisible. The heavy door of the cattle car began to slide open with a screech of metal on metal. Sunlight flooded in, blinding her after so many hours in dimness. Elena squinted against it, her heart racing so fast she thought she might faint. This was it. They'd find her now. They'd send her back. Or worse, Silas Garrett himself might have followed the train, might be waiting out there right now. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, backlit by the morning sun. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. A cowboy, she realized as her eyes adjusted. He stood there for a moment, surveying the cattle, and then his gaze swept across the car and landed directly on her. Elena stopped breathing. The cowboy went very still. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he stepped up into the car, moving with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent his whole life around livestock. The cattle parted around him like water. He made his way toward her, his boots thudding against the wooden floor, and Elena had nowhere to go. She was trapped. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that she could finally see his face beneath the shadow of his hat. He was young, probably no more than 25 or 26, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of whiskey in candlelight. A few days' worth of stubble covered his jaw, and a thin scar traced a line from his cheekbone to his ear. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something compelling about his face, something that made it hard to look away. "You planning on riding all the way to the slaughterhouse with these cattle?" he asked. His voice was deep and rough, with a hint of something that might have been amusement. Elena's mouth was too dry to answer. She just stared at him, her back pressed against the wall, her hands clutching at the rough wood. The cowboy studied her for another moment, his gaze taking in her torn dress, her tangled hair, the exhaustion that must have been written all over her face. Something shifted in his expression. The amusement faded, replaced by something more serious. "You running from something," he said. It wasn't a question. Elena found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Please, please don't send me back." He tilted his head slightly, still watching her with those steady amber eyes. "Back where?" "Omaha or Kansas, anywhere east of here, please." Her voice broke on the last word, and she hated herself for it, for showing this stranger how desperate she was. The cowboy was quiet for a long moment. Then he glanced over his shoulder at the open door of the cattle car, where other men's voices were getting closer. When he looked back at her, his expression had hardened into something determined. "Can you walk?" he asked. Elena nodded, not trusting her voice again. "Then follow me. Quick and quiet, don't make a sound and don't look at anybody. Understand?" She nodded again. He turned and started back toward the door, but not before holding out his hand to her. Elena hesitated for only a heartbeat before taking it. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip firm but not painful. Nothing like Silas Garrett's cruel hands. The cowboy pulled her gently to her feet and then kept hold of her hand as he led her through the cattle. At the door, he paused, peering out. Then he stepped down and pulled her after him, keeping her close to his side. They were at some kind of livestock depot, Elena realized. Cattle cars stretched in both directions along the tracks, and men were everywhere, moving animals, checking manifests, shouting instructions. The cowboy walked quickly but not so fast as to draw attention, keeping Elena tucked against his side like she belonged there. Nobody seemed to notice them. Or if they did, they didn't care. Just another cowboy and his woman, nothing worth a second glance. They crossed the depot yard, weaving between pens of cattle and sheep, and headed toward a row of horses tied to a hitching post near a small building. The cowboy stopped at a tall bay gelding with a white blaze on its face. He untied the reins with his free hand, still holding on to Elena with the other. "You ever ridden before?" he asked quietly. "Yes, some, when I was younger," he nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer. Then he swung up into the saddle with an easy grace and reached down for her. "Come on, up behind me." Elena grasped his arm and he pulled her up as if she weighed nothing. She settled behind the saddle, her legs hanging to one side, and had to grab onto his waist to keep from sliding off. "Hold tight," he said, and then they were moving. The horse broke into a trot, then a canter as they left the depot behind. Elena clung to the cowboy's waist, her face pressed against his back. He smelled like leather and horse and wood smoke, a scent that was somehow comforting in its earthiness. They rode for what felt like forever, but was probably only 20 minutes or so, leaving the depot and the small town around it far behind. The landscape opened up into rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and juniper, with those snow-capped mountains rising in the distance. Finally, the cowboy slowed the horse to a walk and then stopped altogether near a small creek lined with cottonwood trees, their leaves just starting to turn gold with autumn. He dismounted first and then helped Elena down, his hands steady on her waist. Once she was on solid ground, Elena's legs nearly buckled. She'd been cramped in that cattle car for so long, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the escape was draining away, leaving her shaky and weak. The cowboy's hand shot out to steady her. "Easy. When's the last time you ate something?" "Yesterday afternoon. Some biscuits." He shook his head, his expression disapproving. "Sit down before you fall down." Elena sank onto a flat rock near the creek, grateful beyond words. The cowboy pulled a canteen from his saddle and handed it to her. She drank deeply, the water cool and clean, washing away the dust and fear that had coated her throat. While she drank, the cowboy dug into his saddlebag and produced a wrapped package. He opened it to reveal strips of dried beef and some kind of hard bread. He offered them to her without a word. Elena took them with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded and moved away to let his horse drink from the creek. Elena forced herself to eat slowly, though she wanted to devour everything in seconds. The food helped. She could feel strength beginning to seep back into her body, replacing the hollow weakness. When she'd eaten half of what he'd given her, she looked up to find the cowboy watching her. He'd pushed his hat back on his head, and she could see his face more clearly now. There were laugh lines around his eyes despite his young age, and a seriousness in his expression that suggested he'd seen more of life than most men twice his age. "Thank you," Elena said again. "I don't know why you helped me, but thank you. You want to tell me what you're running from?" He asked, his voice gentle despite the directness of the question. Elena looked down at her hands, at the torn and dirty fabric of her dress. "My uncle. He sold me to a man I'd never met, a marriage arrangement. The man was cruel. I couldn't go through with it." The cowboy's jaw tightened. "So you ran." "So I ran," Elena agreed. 3 days ago, I've been on that cattle train since yesterday morning." "You got money? People waiting for you somewhere?" She shook her head. "I have a little money, enough for maybe a week if I'm careful, and no, I don't have anyone. My parents died last winter. My uncle was my only family, and he made it clear I was nothing but a burden to him. That's why he was so eager to marry me off." The cowboy was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the creek. Then he looked back at her. "You got a name, Elena. Elena Foster." "Kane Fletcher," he said. "Most people call me Kane." "Kane," Elena repeated. "Where are we?" "I lost track after the train left Omaha." "We're about 15 miles outside of Kelton, Utah. That depot back there serves most of the ranches in this area. My family's ranch, the Broken Arrow, is about an hour's ride northwest of here." Utah. Elena had never been to Utah. She'd spent her whole life in Nebraska until her parents died, and she'd gone to live with her uncle in Kansas. The realization that she was now in an entirely different territory made her feel both liberated and terrified. "What were you doing at the depot?" she asked. "Checking on a cattle shipment. My father sent me to make sure the count was right and the animals looked healthy. We're expecting them to be delivered to the ranch later this week." Kane paused, then added, "I'm the foreman there, at the Broken Arrow." "You're young to be a foreman," Elena said without thinking, then immediately felt her face flush. "I'm sorry, that was rude." But Kane didn't look offended. If anything, he looked almost amused. "My father's ranch. He started grooming me for the job when I was old enough to sit a horse. My older brother was supposed to take it over, but he headed to California 5 years ago looking for gold. Never came back." There was a story there Elena could tell, but she didn't pry. Instead, she asked, "What am I going to do now?" Kane looked at her steadily. "That depends. You got any skills? Can you cook? So handle livestock? I can cook and sew. My mother taught me. I can manage a household, do accounts, read and write. I helped my father with his business ledgers before he died. But livestock, no. I've never worked with animals." Kane nodded slowly, seeming to turn something over in his mind. Then he said, "Our ranch cook just left last week. Headed back east to be with her daughter who was having a baby. We've been managing with whoever can scramble some eggs and fry some bacon, but it's been rough going. My father's been talking about hiring someone from town, but most of the women in Kelton already have work or families." Elena's heart began to beat faster. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm thinking about it," Kane said carefully, "but you need to understand something first. If your uncle or that man you were promised to come looking for you, and they show up at the Broken Arrow asking questions, it could mean trouble for my family. I don't mind trouble for myself, but I won't bring it down on my father or the ranch hands without them knowing what they're getting into." Elena bit her lip. "I understand. I don't want to cause trouble for you or anyone else. Maybe I should just try to make it to California or somewhere farther away." "With what money? And how?" Kane shook his head. "You wouldn't make it a week on your own out here. This isn't farmland like Nebraska. This is high desert country, and it's unforgiving to people who don't know how to survive in it." He was right, and Elena knew it. The landscape she'd glimpsed on the ride from the depot was beautiful but harsh, nothing like the green fields she'd grown up around. Kane seemed to come to some kind of decision. "Here's what we're going to do. I'll take you back to the Broken Arrow and talk to my father. If he agrees, you can work as our cook. We'll pay you fair wages and give you a place to stay. In return, you keep your head down and your story simple. Anyone asks, you're from back east and looking for work. Nothing about running away or forced marriages. Understood? But what if your father says no? Then I'll take you into Kelton and help you find something else," Kane said. "But I don't think he'll say no. He's been complaining about burned bacon for a week straight." Despite everything, Elena felt a smile tug at her lips. It felt strange on her face after days of fear and despair. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. I could be a thief or a liar or worse." Kane looked at her for a long moment, his amber eyes serious. "You could be. But I don't think you are. I think you're a woman who got dealt a bad hand and did the only thing she could to survive. And maybe I'm a fool, but I believe in helping people when I can. My mother taught me that before she died." There was a weight to those last words, a grief that Elena recognized because she carried the same kind of grief herself. She understood then that Kane Fletcher knew what it was like to lose someone important, to have your world turned upside down by circumstances beyond your control. "Thank you," Elena said quietly. "Truly, I'll work hard, I promise." Kane nodded and stood up, extending his hand to help her to her feet. "We should get moving. It's a good ride to the ranch, and I told my father I'd be back by mid-afternoon." This time, when Elena mounted behind Kane, she felt a little less desperate and a little more hopeful. She wrapped her arms around his waist as the horse moved into a steady lope, carrying them across the high desert landscape toward the mountains. The ride gave Elena time to think and to observe. Kane sat easy in the saddle, moving with the horse's rhythm like it was second nature. He didn't try to make conversation, seemingly content with silence, and Elena found herself grateful for that. Her thoughts were too tangled to make small talk. The land they traveled through was unlike anything she'd seen before. Instead of the endless flat prairies of Nebraska or the rolling farmland of Kansas, this was a place of dramatic contrasts. Sagebrush stretched for miles, broken up by outcroppings of red and gray rock. In the distance, those mountains rose like a promise or a warning, their peaks stark against the brilliant blue sky. The air was thin and dry, so different from the humid summers she'd grown up with. After about an hour, they crested a rise and Kane drew the horse to a stop. "There," he said, pointing. "The Broken Arrow. Elena followed his gesture and saw a collection of buildings nestled in a valley below. The main house was a sprawling structure built of wood and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around at least two sides. Nearby were several smaller buildings. A bunkhouse, a large barn, what looked like a smokehouse, and other outbuildings. Corrals held horses, and in the distance, Elena could see cattle grazing across the valley floor. It was bigger than she'd expected, more established. This wasn't some struggling homestead. This was a successful ranch, the kind that took years or even generations to build. "It's impressive," Elena said honestly. "My grandfather started it in 1855, Kane said, and there was pride in his voice. Built the original cabin with his own hands. My father expanded it over the years. We run about 2,000 head of cattle and a string of horses that are getting a reputation throughout the territory. It's good land, as long as you know how to work with it instead of against it." He urged the horse forward, and they made their way down into the valley. As they got closer, Elena could see people moving around the ranch. Men working with horses in one of the corrals, someone carrying something into the barn. The place hummed with activity. Kane rode straight up to the main house and dismounted, then helped Elena down. Her legs were steadier now, thank goodness. She didn't want to meet Kane's father by collapsing at his feet. The front door of the house opened, and a man stepped out onto the porch. He was tall like Kane, but broader through the shoulders, with gray threaded liberally through his dark hair. His face was weathered by years in the sun, lined with the kind of deep creases that came from squinting at distant horizons. He had the same amber-colored eyes as his son. "You're late," the man said, his voice carrying across the yard. "I was starting to think you'd decided to buy the whole herd and bring them home yourself." "Got delayed," Kane said. He kept his hand on Elena's elbow, a gesture of support that she appreciated more than she could say. "The count was right, and the cattle looked healthy. They'll be here by Friday." The older man's gaze had shifted to Elena, his expression curious but not unkind. "And who's this?" "This is Elena Foster," Kane said. "I found her in a difficult situation at the depot. She's a cook looking for work, and I told her we might have a position available." Elena saw the older man's eyes sharpen, taking in her appearance. The torn dress, the tangled hair, the exhaustion she knew must be written all over her face. He was no fool. He knew there was more to the story than Kane was saying. "Is that so?" he said slowly. Then he looked at his son. "Kane, why don't you come inside for a minute? Miss Foster, you're welcome to wait on the porch. There's water in the pitcher there and a cup." Kane squeezed Elena's elbow gently and then released her, following his father into the house. The door closed behind them, leaving Elena alone on the porch. She sank into one of the wooden chairs, her legs suddenly weak again. Through the window, she could see Kane and his father talking, their voices too low to hear but their gestures animated. The older man looked skeptical. Kane looked determined. Elena closed her eyes and sent up a silent prayer to a God she wasn't entirely sure was listening anymore. "Please. Please let this work out. I have nowhere else to go." The conversation inside seemed to go on forever. Finally, the door opened again and both men stepped out. Elena stood up quickly, trying to read their expressions. Kane's father studied her for a long moment, then said, "My name is Kenneth Fletcher. Kane tells me you can cook and manage a household." "Yes, sir," Elena said. "My mother trained me well. I can cook for large groups, preserve food, manage supplies and accounts. I'll work hard, I promise." "He also tells me you're running from something," Kenneth said bluntly. "And before you deny it, understand that I don't appreciate being lied to, especially not on my own property." Elena felt her face flush, but she met his gaze steadily. "I'm running from a forced marriage to a cruel man." My uncle arranged it without my consent and took money for it. I won't go back to that life. I'd rather die out here in the desert than marry Silas Garrett." Kenneth's expression shifted slightly at her honesty. "This man, Garrett, he the type to come looking for you?" "I don't know," Elena admitted. "He paid my uncle a substantial sum. He might consider me his property now, or he might decide I'm not worth the trouble and demand his money back from my uncle." "And your uncle?" "He'll want me found, if only to save his own reputation and avoid having to return the money." Kenneth nodded slowly. "All right. Here's the deal. You can work here as our cook. You'll get room and board plus $20 a month. That's fair wages for this area. You'll have your own room off the kitchen, and you'll be expected to prepare 3 meals a day for myself, Kane, and the 6 ranch hands we keep year-round. During cattle drives or busy seasons, that number might go up. You'll also be expected to keep the kitchen and dining areas clean and manage our food supplies. $20 a month. That was more than Elena had hoped for, more than she'd ever earned in her life. "That's very generous, sir." "It's fair," Kenneth corrected. "But understand this, Miss Foster. If trouble comes calling because of you, I expect you to face it honestly. I won't have lies and deception under my roof. And if this Garrett or your uncle show up here, we'll deal with it together, as a household. I don't abandon people who work for me, but I also don't tolerate being played for a fool. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, sir," Elena said. "And thank you. You won't regret this." Kenneth looked at Kane. "Show her to her room and then give her a tour of the kitchen. She can start with dinner tonight. I'll let the boys know we've got a new cook." "Yes, sir," Kane said, but there was a warmth in his voice that suggested this wasn't just an employer-employee relationship. This was a father and son who trusted each other. Kenneth nodded to both of them and headed back into the house. Kane turned to Elena with something that might have been relief on his face. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you settled." The house was even more impressive inside than out. The main room was spacious, with a large stone fireplace and furniture that was worn but well made. Everything was clean but had a slightly neglected air, the kind that came from a household without a woman's touch. Kane led Elena through to the kitchen, which was large and well equipped with a massive cast iron stove, a long work table, and shelves lined with dishes and cooking implements. A door at the back of the kitchen opened into a small room. It wasn't much, just big enough for a narrow bed, a dresser, and a chair, but it had a window that looked out toward the mountains, and to Elena, it looked like heaven. "It's perfect," she said softly. Kane nodded. "It's not fancy, but it's private. That door has a lock on the inside, and you should use it. The ranch hands are good men, but it's better to be safe. The bathing room is just down the hall, and there's a pump in the kitchen for water." Elena turned to face him. "Kane, I don't know how to thank you." "You can thank me by making something edible for dinner," Kane said, but his tone was gentle, teasing. "We've been living on burned beans and tough steak for a week." Despite everything, Elena felt herself smile again. "I think I can manage better than that." "Good. I'll leave you to get settled. If you need anything, just holler. Someone's always around." He left, pulling the door closed behind him, and Elena was finally, blessedly alone. She sat down on the bed, which was surprisingly comfortable, and for the first time in 3 days, she let herself fully feel the weight of everything that had happened. She'd escaped. She'd run away from a life that would have destroyed her slowly, day by day, year by year. And somehow, miraculously, she'd ended up here, in this place that felt about as far from Kansas and her uncle's house as she could get while still being on the same earth. And Kane. She couldn't stop thinking about Kane. The way he'd found her in that cattle car and, instead of turning her in or ignoring her, had made the choice to help her. A complete stranger, and he'd offered her not just escape but an actual life, a job, a place to start over. She didn't understand it, but she was grateful beyond words. Elena stood up and went to the small mirror hanging on the wall. She looked terrible, she realized. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair a tangled mess. She couldn't meet Kenneth Fletcher's ranch hands looking like this. There was a wash basin on the dresser, and Elena found it filled with clean water. Someone, probably Cain, had thought to prepare the room for her. She washed her face and hands, then did her best to untangle her hair and braid it into something presentable. Her dress was beyond help, but it would have to do for now. Tomorrow she could see about washing it or maybe buying fabric in town to make a new one. Once she looked moderately presentable, Elena ventured back out into the kitchen. She spent the next hour familiarizing herself with where everything was kept, taking inventory of the supplies. The pantry was well stocked with basics: flour, sugar, salt, dried beans, preserved vegetables. There was a smokehouse outside with hanging meat, and a cold cellar with fresh vegetables that someone was clearly trying to keep up with. By the time the sun started to lower toward the mountains, Elena had a plan for dinner. She'd found a decent piece of beef, potatoes, onions, and some dried herbs. Nothing fancy, but she could make a good stew, and there was enough flour and lard to make biscuits. She set to work, and it felt good to have something to do with her hands, something familiar and useful. Cooking had always been a comfort to her, a way to show love and care. Her mother used to say that you could tell a lot about a person by the way they cooked, whether they put thought and care into it or just went through the motions. Elena put care into this meal. She browned the beef carefully, sautéed the onions until they were sweet, added the potatoes and herbs and enough water to make a rich gravy. While the stew simmered, she mixed up biscuit dough and shaped it with practiced hands. The kitchen filled with good smells, and Elena felt a sense of satisfaction that she hadn't experienced in a long time. This was something she was good at, something she could contribute. As the sun touched the mountain peaks, men started filtering into the dining room. Elena could hear them through the door, talking and laughing, the scrape of chairs as they settled at the table. She took a deep breath, smoothed her hands over her dress, and carried the first pot of stew out. The conversation died as she entered. 6 men sat at the long table with Kenneth at the head and Cain to his right. All eyes turned to her, curious and appraising. "Gentlemen," Kenneth said, "this is Elena Foster. She's our new cook. I expect you all to treat her with respect and courtesy." There was a chorus of "Yes, sir," and "Madam" as Elena set the pot down and went back for the biscuits. When she returned, Kenneth was ladling stew into bowls, and the men were passing them around. Elena retreated to the kitchen, her heart pounding. She'd seen the way some of the men had looked at her, not with disrespect exactly, but with interest. She was a young woman in a household of men. She'd have to be careful, have to establish boundaries. But when she peeked through the door a few minutes later, what she saw made her relax slightly. The men were eating with the kind of focused intensity that said they appreciated the food. One of them, a grizzled older man with silver hair, actually closed his eyes in what looked like bliss as he bit into a biscuit. Cain caught her eye through the doorway and gave her a small nod, the corner of his mouth quirking up. She felt an odd flutter in her chest at that look, something that had nothing to do with fear or exhaustion and everything to do with the man himself. Elena quickly pulled back, confused by her own reaction. She barely knew Cain Fletcher. He'd helped her, yes, but that didn't mean anything beyond simple human kindness. She couldn't afford to develop feelings for him or anyone else. She needed to focus on survival, on building a new life, on staying hidden from Sela's garret and her uncle. But as she cleaned up the kitchen and listened to the low murmur of male voices from the dining room, she couldn't help remembering the feel of Cain's hand in hers, warm and steady, as he'd led her out of the cattle car and into this new life. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Elena rose before dawn each morning to start breakfast for the men. She learned their names and preferences. Hank, the grizzled older man who loved her biscuits; Dutch, a quiet man in his 30s who always thanked her politely; Marcus and James, two younger cowboys who were always joking with each other; Ray, the horse trainer who could coax miracles out of the most stubborn animals; and Samuel, the youngest at 19, who blushed every time Elena spoke to him. And Cain, of course. Cain, who was always the first one up after her, appearing in the kitchen just as the coffee started to boil. He never said much in the mornings, just poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter, watching her work with those steady amber eyes. At first, his presence made her nervous. But as the days passed, Elena found herself looking forward to those quiet mornings before the rest of the household woke up. They'd talk sometimes, soft conversations about nothing important: the weather, the cattle, the progress of the fall roundup that was coming up. Other times they just shared the silence, and that was nice too. Kenneth Fletcher proved to be a fair employer, just as he'd promised. He paid Elena her wages at the end of the first week, counting out the money carefully into her hand. "You've earned this," he said. "The men are happier than they've been in months, and I haven't had heartburn in days." Elena had saved every penny, hiding it in a small pouch under her mattress. It was her escape fund, just in case. Just in case Silas Garrett showed up. Just in case her uncle tracked her down. Just in case the fragile safety of the Broken Arrow shattered and she had to run again. But weeks passed, and nothing happened. September faded into October, and the aspen trees in the high country turned gold. The weather grew colder, especially at night, and Elena learned to keep the kitchen stove burning to take the chill off her little room. She learned the rhythms of ranch life: the early mornings, the long days of hard work, the men coming in tired and hungry at sunset. She learned that Kenneth Fletcher had a dry sense of humor and a deep love for his land. She learned that Hank had been with the ranch since Kenneth's father was alive and considered himself part of the family. She learned that Samuel was sweet on a girl in town but too shy to do anything about it. And she learned that Cain Fletcher was unlike any man she'd ever met. He was patient with the younger cowboys, teaching them skills without making them feel stupid. He was firm but never cruel with the horses. He worked harder than anyone else on the ranch, often the first out in the morning and the last in at night. And he was unfailingly kind to Elena, going out of his way to make sure she had everything she needed, that she felt safe and welcome. It was that kindness that undid her, slowly but surely. Elena tried to keep her distance, tried to maintain the proper boundaries between employer and employee. But it was hard when Cain would smile at her across the breakfast table, his whole face lighting up in a way that made her heart skip. It was hard when he'd bring her fresh herbs from the garden, remembering that she'd mentioned wanting some for cooking. It was hard when he'd appear in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed, drawn by some instinct that told him she was still awake, unable to sleep, haunted by memories of Silas Garrett's cold eyes and cruel hands. "Can't sleep?" He'd ask, and Elena would shake her head, and Cain would sit down at the kitchen table and just keep her company until the fear loosened its grip on her throat, and she could breathe again. They never talked about it directly, never acknowledged what was building between them. But Elena knew, and she suspected Cain knew too. It was early November when everything changed. Elena was in town, having convinced Kenneth to let her take the wagon in to buy supplies. Kelton was a small town, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other businesses. It wasn't much, but it was busy enough, a hub for the ranches and homesteads scattered throughout the valley. She was in the general store, debating between two different types of flour, when she heard a voice behind her that made her blood run cold. "Excuse me, madam. I'm looking for someone." A young woman, dark hair, pretty, might have come through here about a month or so ago. Name of Elena Foster. Elena's hands froze on the flour sack. Slowly, carefully, she glanced over her shoulder. A man stood at the counter, talking to the shopkeeper. He was tall and broad, dressed in expensive clothes that marked him as someone with money. His hair was iron gray, and when he turned slightly, Elena saw his profile. Silas Garrett. He'd found her. After all these weeks of peace, of beginning to believe she might actually be safe, he'd found her. Elena's first instinct was to run, but she forced herself to stay still. If she bolted now, she'd draw attention. Instead, she turned away from him, kept her head down, and pretended to be very interested in the flour. "Can't say I've seen anyone by that name," the shopkeeper was saying. "But we get a lot of folks passing through. What's your interest in this woman?" "She's my fiancée," Silas said smoothly. "There was a misunderstanding and she left before our wedding. Her uncle is very worried about her. I've been searching for weeks." The lie rolled off his tongue so easily that Elena felt sick. His fiancée. As if she'd ever agreed to marry him. As if she'd had any choice at all. "Well, if I see her, I'll let you know," the shopkeeper said. "You staying in town at the hotel for a few days while I ask around. There's a reward for information leading to her whereabouts. $50. $50. That was a fortune to most people in Kelton. Elena felt her heart sink. Someone would talk. Someone would remember the new cook at the Broken Arrow, the woman who'd arrived mysteriously about a month ago with no past and no references. Elena abandoned the flour and moved toward the back of the store, pretending to look at fabric. She needed to get out of here before Silas saw her, before someone pointed her out. But the front door was the only exit, and Silas was standing right there. She was trapped. The bell over the door chimed, and a familiar voice said, "Afternoon, Mr. Peterson. I'm here to pick up the order for the Broken Arrow." Kane. Elena's head snapped up, and she saw him standing in the doorway, his hat in his hand. His eyes swept the store and landed on her, and she saw them widen slightly as he took in her expression. Then his gaze moved to Silas Garrett, and something shifted in Kane's face. A hardening, a wariness. He couldn't possibly know who Silas was, but he clearly sensed something was wrong. "Be right with you, Kane," the shopkeeper said. "Just helping this gentleman here." Kane moved into the store, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He walked past Silas without a glance and came straight to Elena. "There you are," he said easily, as if they'd planned to meet here. "Father asked me to help you load the wagon. You about done here?" Elena swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, I was just finishing up." "Good. Let's settle up and head out. We want to get back before dark." He took her elbow, a gesture that looked casual but was clearly protective, and guided her toward the counter. Silas had moved aside, examining some goods on a shelf, apparently not paying them any attention. But Elena felt his gaze on her back, assessing, suspicious. Kane paid for Elena's purchases quickly, then loaded her arms with packages to carry. "Go on out to the wagon," he said quietly. "I'll be right behind you." Elena didn't argue. She walked out of the store as naturally as she could, not looking at Silas, not drawing attention. Her hands were shaking so badly, she nearly dropped the packages as she reached the wagon. Kane emerged a moment later with the rest of the supplies. He loaded them into the wagon bed efficiently, then helped Elena up onto the bench seat and climbed up beside her. Only when they were moving, the wagon rolling down the main street away from the general store, did he speak. "That was him, wasn't it? The man you're running from." "Yes," Elena whispered. "That was Silas Garrett." Kane's jaw tightened. "Did he recognize you? I don't think so. But he's offering a reward for information. $50. Someone will talk, Kane. Someone will tell him about me." "Maybe, maybe not." Kane kept his eyes on the road ahead. "The folks around here are loyal to the Broken Arrow. My family's been here a long time. We take care of our own." "I'm not your own," Elena said miserably. "I'm just your cook, and $50 is a lot of money to people struggling to make ends meet." Kane was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're more than just our cook, Elena. You've been part of the household for over a month now. My father likes you. The men like you. And he stopped, seemed to wrestle with something, then said more firmly, "You're one of us now. We don't give up our own to men like Silas Garrett." Elena felt tears sting her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. "You don't understand. He won't give up. He'll ask around. He'll find out about the ranch. He'll come there. Then we'll deal with it," Kane said. His voice was calm, certain. "Together. Kane, I can't ask you to do this. I can't ask your father or the ranch hands to stand up against a man like Silas. He has money. He has influence. He could cause real trouble for the Broken Arrow." Kane finally looked at her, and the intensity in his amber eyes made her breath catch. "You're not asking. I'm offering. There's a difference." He paused, then added more softly, "I won't let him take you, Elena. I won't let anyone hurt you. Not while I'm breathing." The way he said it, the absolute conviction in his voice, made something crack open in Elena's chest. All the fear, all the loneliness, all the careful walls she'd built around her heart over the past month came tumbling down, and she realized with startling clarity that she'd fallen in love with Kane Fletcher. She was in love with the cowboy who'd found her hiding in a cattle car and, instead of sending her back to a life she couldn't bear, had said, "Run to me instead." Those hadn't been his exact words, but they might as well have been. That's what he'd offered her that first day. A place to run to, a place to be safe, a place to be herself. And now he was offering it again, even though it might cost him everything. "Kane," she started, her voice thick with emotion, but he shook his head. "We'll talk later. Right now, let's get home and tell my father what's happening. He needs to know." The ride back to the ranch seemed to take forever and no time at all. When they pulled up to the house, Kenneth was on the porch, clearly waiting for them. One look at their faces told him something was wrong. "Inside," he said shortly. "Both of you." In the kitchen, with the door closed for privacy, Elena told them everything. She told them about her parents' death, about her uncle's cruelty, about the marriage arrangement with Silas Garrett. She described the bruises on her arms from where Silas had grabbed her, the cold calculation in his eyes when he'd looked at her like she was a horse he was considering buying. She told them about running, about the cattle train, about the terror of those 3 days thinking she'd be caught at any moment. And she told them about seeing Silas in the general store, about the reward he was offering. Kenneth listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "He'll come here," Kenneth finally said. "If he's smart, and it sounds like he is, he'll hear about the new cook at the Broken Arrow and put 2 and 2 together." "I know," Elena said miserably. "I should leave. I should go tonight, before he shows up and causes trouble for you." "You're not going anywhere," Kenneth said firmly. "And before you argue, understand this. I don't like being bullied, and I especially don't like men who hurt women. This Silas Garrett can come here if he wants. He'll find a united front." "Father," Kane said quietly, "he's offering a substantial reward. Some of the hands might be tempted." "Then we'll know who has character and who doesn't," Kenneth replied. "I'll talk to the men tonight. They deserve to know what's happening, but I trust them, Kane. Every man on this ranch was handpicked by me or by you. They're good men." Elena felt tears spill over despite her best efforts to hold them back. "I don't understand. Why would you do this for me? Risk so much." Kenneth's expression softened. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because my wife, God rest her soul, would have done the same for any woman in your situation. And because my son cares about you, and I trust his judgment." Elena's gaze flew to Cain, who was looking at his father with an expression that was part surprise, part gratitude. "I'll gather the men after dinner," Kenneth continued. "We'll have a meeting, lay everything out. For now, let's go about our normal routine. No sense borrowing trouble before it arrives." That evening, after the dishes were cleared and Elena had retreated to her room, she heard the low murmur of voices from the bunkhouse. Kenneth and Cain were talking to the ranch hands. She pressed her face against her pillow, praying that none of them would decide $50 was worth betraying her. An hour later, there was a soft knock on her door. Elena opened it to find Cain standing there, his hat in his hands. "They're with us," he said simply. "Every last one of them. Hank said he'd shoot anyone who even thought about collecting that reward, and Dutch backed him up. The younger boys were ready to ride into town tonight and run Garrett out themselves, but Father talked them down." Elena felt her knees go weak with relief. "Truly, truly. You're part of our family now, Elena. We protect family. Family." The word hit Elena like a physical blow. She hadn't had a family since her parents died. Her uncle had made it clear she was a burden, an obligation. But here, in this unlikely place, with these rough cowboys and this stern but kind rancher, she'd found something that felt like belonging. "Thank you," she whispered. Cain stepped closer, so close she could smell the familiar scent of leather and wood smoke that always clung to him. "Elena, I need to say something and I need you to listen." She nodded, not trusting her voice. "When I found you in that cattle car, I didn't know what I was getting into. I just saw someone who needed help and I couldn't walk away. But over these past weeks, you've become important to me. More important than I probably should admit." He paused, his amber eyes searching her face. "I don't want you to leave, not because we need a cook, but because I need you. I've been trying to figure out the right way to say this, the right time, but there isn't a perfect moment. So I'm just going to say it straight. I'm falling in love with you, Elena Foster. I might have already fallen. And if Silas Garrett thinks he's going to take you away from here, from me, he's got another thing coming." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She'd hoped, maybe, that Cain felt something for her beyond simple kindness. But hearing him say it out loud, hearing the raw honesty in his voice, made her realize just how deeply her own feelings ran. "I love you too," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I think I started falling in love with you that first day when you held out your hand to help me out of that cattle car. You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to risk anything for a stranger, but you did, and you've been doing it ever since." Cain's face lit up with a smile so brilliant it transformed him. Then he was cupping her face in his calloused hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I want to kiss you," he said softly, "but only if you want that too." "I want that," Elena whispered. Cain leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but Elena had never been more certain of anything. When his lips finally touched hers, it was gentle and sweet and perfect. Not like Silas's brutal attempt to force a kiss on her, but a question and an answer all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Cain rested his forehead against hers. "We'll get through this," he promised. "Whatever happens with Garrett, we'll face it together." Elena believed him. For the first time in a long time, she believed that everything might actually be all right. Silas Garrett arrived at the Broken Arrow 3 days later. Elena was in the kitchen, making bread, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Something in the rhythm of the hoofbeats made her look up, a prickle of unease running down her spine. She went to the window and felt her heart stop. Silas sat atop a fine black horse, looking every inch the wealthy rancher he was. He dismounted with practiced ease and tied his horse to the hitching post outside the house. Then he straightened his expensive coat and walked up to the front door. Elena couldn't move. She stood frozen at the window, her hands covered in flour as Silas knocked on the door. She heard Kenneth's heavy footsteps crossing the main room, heard the door open. "Can I help you?" Kenneth's voice was polite but not welcoming. "Good afternoon. My name is Silas Garrett. I'm looking for someone and I was told she might be here. A young woman named Elena Foster." "What's your business with Miss Foster?" Kenneth asked. "She's my fiancée. There was a misunderstanding and she left before our wedding. I've been searching for her for weeks now. Her family is very worried." "Is that so?" Kenneth's voice was flat, giving nothing away. Elena forced herself to move. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked out of the kitchen, through the dining room and into the main room. Kenneth stood in the open doorway, blocking Silas's view of the interior. But when Elena approached, Kenneth stepped aside, and she found herself face to face with the man she'd been running from. Silas's eyes lit up with triumph when he saw her. "Elena, thank God, I've been so worried about you." "I'm not your fiancée," Elena said, surprised by how steady her voice was. "I never agreed to marry you. My uncle made that arrangement without my consent." "Your uncle is your legal guardian," Silas said, his voice hardening slightly. "He has the right to arrange your marriage." "I'm 21 years old. I don't need a guardian, and I have the right to refuse a marriage I don't want." Silas took a step forward, his hand reaching for her. Elena automatically stepped back and Kenneth moved to block Silas's path. "I think you'd better leave," Kenneth said quietly. "Miss Foster has made her position clear." Silas's eyes narrowed. "You're harboring a woman who's promised to another man. That could be considered theft." "I'm not property," Elena said fiercely. "You can't steal what was never owned." "Your uncle took my money. Quite a lot of money, in fact. That makes you my responsibility whether you like it or not." "Then take it up with my uncle," Elena shot back. "Demand your money back from him. I owe you nothing." Silas's facade of civility was cracking. Elena could see the anger building behind his cold eyes, the same anger she'd seen when he'd grabbed her arms hard enough to bruise. "Elena, you're being irrational," Silas said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "A woman alone in the world needs protection. I can provide that. I can give you a good home, security, everything you need." "What I need is to make my own choices," Elena said, "and I choose not to marry you." "You'll regret this," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think hiding out here on this ranch will keep you safe. I have lawyers. I have influence. I can make things very difficult for everyone involved. And I have the law on my side," Kenneth said firmly. "Miss Foster is an adult woman who has made her choice. You have no legal claim to her. If you continue to harass her, or if you threaten anyone on my property, I'll have the sheriff out here so fast your head will spin." Silas's jaw clenched. For a moment, Elena thought he might actually try to force the issue, might try to grab her and drag her away. But then footsteps sounded on the porch behind him, and he turned to see Kane climbing the steps, with Hank, Dutch, and the rest of the ranch hands spreading out behind him. They weren't making any threatening moves, weren't even armed as far as Elena could see. But there were 8 of them, all tall and work-hardened, and the message was clear. Silas was outnumbered. Kane came to stand beside his father, his amber eyes locked on Silas. "Problem here, just a misunderstanding," Kenneth said easily. "Mr. Garrett was just leaving." Silas looked around at the assembled men, his expression cold with fury. "This isn't over," he said, looking directly at Elena. You can hide here for now, but eventually you'll have to leave. And when you do, I'll be waiting. If you come near her again, you'll answer to me, Cain said quietly. There was no bravado in his voice, just simple fact. Silas's lip curled. And who are you? Another hired hand. I'm the man who's going to marry her, Cain said. So unless you want to face down her husband, I suggest you ride away and don't come back. The words hung in the air, shocking everyone. Elena's head whipped around to stare at Cain. They'd confessed their feelings for each other, yes, but they hadn't talked about marriage. They'd known each other for less than 2 months. But Cain's face was set in determined lines, and when his eyes met hers, Elena saw the truth there. He meant it. He was offering her the ultimate protection, his name, his family, his whole life. Silas laughed, a harsh sound. You expect me to believe you're engaged to this ranch hand? Believe what you want, Cain said. But Elena Foster is under the protection of the Fletcher family now. You do best to remember that. Silas stared at them for a long moment, his eyes moving from Cain to Elena to Kenneth and back again. Whatever he saw there must have convinced him he wasn't going to win this fight, at least not today. He turned on his heel and walked to his horse, mounting in one fluid motion. You'll regret this, he said again, looking at Elena. All of you will. Then he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, dust rising in his wake. Nobody moved until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Then Kenneth let out a long breath and closed the door. Well, he said, that went about as well as could be expected. Elena turned to Cain, her heart racing. Did you mean it? What you said about marrying me? Cain took her hands in his, not seeming to care that they were still covered in flour. Every word. I know we haven't known each other long, and I know this isn't the most romantic proposal, but I meant what I said. I want to marry you, Elena. I want you to be my wife, to build a life with you if you'll have me. Elena felt tears spilling down her cheeks again, but for once they were happy tears. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. Cain pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, and Elena buried her face in his chest. She felt safe here, safer than she'd felt in months, maybe safer than she'd ever felt. All right then, Kenneth said, and there was warmth in his voice. I suppose we should talk to the preacher in town about a wedding. Soon, Cain said, not letting go of Elena. As soon as possible. I don't want Garrett to have any chance to cause trouble. Agreed, Kenneth said. Dutch, ride into town and ask Reverend Morrison if he can come out here tomorrow. Yes, sir, Dutch said and headed for the door. The other ranch hands were grinning broadly. Hank clapped Cain on the shoulder as he passed. About time you found yourself a wife, boy. Your mother would be pleased. Samuel, blushing as usual, mumbled his congratulations. Marcus and James were already arguing about who was going to be the best man, and Ray was laughing at them. Elena pulled back just enough to look up at Cain's face. Are you sure about this? You don't have to marry me just to protect me from Silas. I'm not marrying you just to protect you, Cain said firmly. I'm marrying you because I love you, because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because you make everything better just by being here. The protection is just a bonus. Elena smiled through her tears. I love you too, so much. Cain kissed her then, right there in front of his father and the ranch hands, a kiss that promised forever. When they finally broke apart, Elena heard Hank making exaggerated gagging sounds and the younger cowboys whooping and hollering. All right, break it up, Kenneth said, but he was smiling. We've got work to do if we're having a wedding tomorrow. Elena, I assume you'll need a dress. Cain, you need to not smell like a horse for once in your life. Everyone else back to work. We'll celebrate properly after the ceremony. The next 24 hours passed in a blur. Elena didn't have time to make a new dress, but she did have a green calico dress that she'd been saving, the nicest thing she owned. She washed it carefully and pressed it, and one of the ranch wives from a neighboring property, summoned by Kenneth, helped her take it in so it fit better. Kane disappeared into town with his father and came back looking scrubbed and nervous in a clean white shirt and dark pants. His hair was still damp from washing, and Elena thought he'd never looked more handsome. Reverend Morrison arrived at noon the next day, a kindly older man who didn't ask too many questions about the sudden wedding. Kenneth had clearly explained the situation, at least the basics, and the Reverend seemed content to help. They were married in the main room of the ranch house, with Kenneth standing up as Kane's best man and the ranch wife, Mrs. Paulson, standing with Elena. All the ranch hands crowded in to watch, dressed in their Sunday best, and Hank had actually combed his hair for the occasion. Elena's hands trembled as she stood facing Kane, but when he took her hands in his, steady and warm, the trembling stopped. This was right. This was what she wanted. Do you, Kane Fletcher, take Elena Foster to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? I do, Kane said firmly, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. And do you, Elena Foster, take Kane Fletcher to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? I do, Elena whispered. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. Kane, you may kiss your bride. Kane cupped Elena's face in his hands and kissed her gently, sweetly, and Elena felt her heart soar. She was married. She was safe. She was loved. The ranch hands cheered, and Hank produced a harmonica from somewhere and started playing a cheerful tune. Mrs. Paulson had brought a cake, and Kenneth brought out a bottle of whiskey that he claimed had been saved for a special occasion. Welcome to the family, Kenneth said to Elena, pulling her into a brief, awkward hug. My son chose well. Thank you, Elena said, meaning it with her whole heart. For everything. For taking me in, for protecting me, for accepting me. You're a Fletcher now, Kenneth said simply. We take care of our own. That night, after the celebrating had died down and the ranch hands had returned to the bunkhouse, Kane led Elena out onto the porch. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any city lights, and the air was cold and crisp with the promise of winter. Are you happy? Kane asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Elena leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body. Happier than I ever thought I could be. 2 months ago, I was hiding in a cattle car, convinced my life was over. And now I'm married to the most wonderful man I've ever met, living on a beautiful ranch with a family that actually wants me. 2 months ago, I was going through the motions, Kane said. Working hard, doing my job, but not really living. And then I found you and everything changed. You changed everything, Elena. She turned in his arms to face him. I'm still scared sometimes. Scared that Silas will come back, that he'll cause trouble, that I'll lose all of this. He won't take you, Kane promised. You're mine now and I'm yours, and that's not changing. We'll build a life together, Elena. A real life. Children, maybe, if you want them, growing old together, all of it. I want all of it, Elena said. I want everything with you. Kane kissed her again, slow and deep, and Elena felt desire kindle low in her belly. This was her wedding night, she realized. They were married, truly married, and this handsome, kind, strong man was her husband. Come on, Kane said softly, taking her hand. Let's go to bed. He led her to his room, which was now their room, and closed the door behind them. The room was simple but comfortable, with a large bed covered in a quilt that Kane said his mother had made, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. Kane lit a lantern, casting soft light across the room. Then he turned to Elena, suddenly looking nervous. I want you to know, he said quietly, we don't have to do anything tonight if you're not ready. I know this has all happened fast. I can wait. Elena felt a rush of love for this man who was so careful with her, so considerate of her feelings. "I'm ready," she said. "I want this. I want you." She reached up and began unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers clumsy with nerves but determined. Kane stood still, letting her undress him, his breathing growing heavier as she pushed the shirt off his shoulders. His chest was broad and muscled from years of hard work, tanned from the sun, and Elena couldn't resist running her hands over it, marveling at the feel of him. Kane made a sound low in his throat, his control clearly slipping. Then his hands were on her, carefully unlacing her dress, peeling away the layers until she stood before him in just her shift. His eyes darkened with desire as he looked at her, and Elena felt beautiful under his gaze, wanted in a way she'd never experienced before. What followed was tender and sweet and sometimes awkward, as first times often are. But Kane was patient and gentle, and when they finally came together, Elena felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. This was what it was supposed to be like, she realized. This connection, this joining of two people who loved each other. Not what Silas would have forced on her, not duty or obligation, but something beautiful and right. Afterwards, they lay tangled together, Elena's head on Kane's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. Kane's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, and Elena felt utterly content. "I love you," Kane murmured into her hair. "I love you too," Elena whispered back. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and Elena slept more peacefully than she had in months. The next few weeks passed in a haze of happiness. Elena settled into her role as Kane's wife, and the ranch hands quickly adjusted to calling her Mrs. Fletcher instead of Elena. She continued to cook for everyone, refusing to give up something she enjoyed just because she was now the foreman's wife. Kenneth was clearly pleased with the match. He told Elena privately that he'd been worried about Kane after his older brother had left, worried that Kane would work himself into the ground without ever taking time for his own life. But marriage had softened some of Kane's edges, made him quicker to smile, more willing to take an afternoon off now and then to spend time with his wife. Elena bloomed under Kane's love and the acceptance of her new family. She put on weight that she'd lost during her weeks of running and fear. Color came back to her cheeks. She laughed freely now, her joy bubbling over in everything she did. Winter came to the high desert, bringing snow to the mountains and cold winds to the valley. The ranch work slowed somewhat. The cattle huddled in sheltered areas, the men spending more time repairing equipment and buildings in preparation for spring. Elena loved the winter evenings when the work was done early and she could sit by the fire with Kane, his arm around her, talking about everything and nothing. Kenneth would often join them, and they'd spend hours in comfortable companionship, sometimes talking, sometimes just enjoying the warmth and the silence. It was in late December, just before Christmas, when Elena realized she was pregnant. She'd missed her monthly courses and had been feeling nauseous in the mornings. At first, she'd thought it was just a winter cold, but when the symptoms persisted and she began to notice other changes in her body, she understood. She was going to have a baby. Kane's baby. Elena was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. She'd always wanted children someday, but she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. They'd only been married for 2 months. But as the reality sank in, the fear faded and was replaced by joy. A baby. A child created from her love for Kane and his love for her. A new Fletcher to carry on the family name. She told Kane that night, after everyone else had gone to bed. They were in their room, getting ready for sleep, and Elena couldn't hold it in any longer. "Kane, I need to tell you something." He looked up from pulling off his boots, concern immediately flickering across his face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, at least I don't think so. I'm pregnant," Kane went very still. Then he slowly stood up, his eyes searching her face. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. But yes, I'm sure. We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Kane just stared at her. Then his face split into the biggest smile Elena had ever seen. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and swept her up into his arms, spinning her around. "We're having a baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Elena, we're having a baby." He set her down carefully, suddenly looking worried. "Wait, should I not be spinning you around? Is that bad for you?" "For the baby," Elena laughed, the sound bright and happy. "I'm fine. We're fine. I'm only a few weeks along." Kane knelt down in front of her and placed his hands on her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one," he said softly. "I'm your father. I can't wait to meet you." Elena felt tears prick her eyes at the tenderness in his voice. This was what she'd always dreamed of: a loving husband, a child, a real home. And somehow, miraculously, she'd found it all. Kenneth was thrilled when they told him the next morning. "A grandchild," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "My wife would have been over the moon. She always wanted grandchildren." "We'll name the baby after her if it's a girl," Kane said spontaneously, "if Elena agrees." "What was her name?" Elena asked. "Margaret," Kenneth said, his voice rough with emotion. "Maggie, we called her." "Then Margaret it is if we have a daughter," Elena agreed. "It's a beautiful name." The ranch hands were equally excited by the news. Hank immediately started carving a cradle from a piece of cedar wood. Dutch's wife sent over a stack of soft flannel that she said would be perfect for baby clothes. Samuel blushed and stammered his congratulations. Marcus and James got into an argument about whether the baby would be a boy or a girl. "Boy," Marcus said confidently. "Fletcher men make boys first." "It's tradition." "There's no such thing as tradition for that," James argued. "It's just luck." "I don't care either way," Kane said, his arm around Elena. "As long as Elena and the baby are healthy, that's all that matters." But privately later that night, he admitted to Elena that he hoped for a son first. Someone to teach to ride and rope. Someone to pass the ranch down to eventually. "And what if we have a daughter?" Elena teased. "Then I'll teach her to ride and rope," Kane said without hesitation. "And heaven help any boy who tries to court her. I'll run them all off." Elena laughed and kissed him. "We'll love whoever we have." "We will," Kane agreed, his hand coming to rest on her stomach. "We absolutely will." The winter passed peacefully. Elena grew rounder as the baby grew inside her, and Kane became increasingly protective, insisting she not lift anything heavy or work too hard. Kenneth teased him mercilessly about it, but Elena could see the older man was just as protective in his own way, always making sure she had enough to eat and a warm place to sit. Spring came, bringing with it the bustle of calving season and preparations for the summer cattle drive. Elena's pregnancy advanced, and by April she was noticeably round. The baby moved constantly now, and Kane would spend hours with his hand on her belly, feeling the kicks and movements with wonder on his face. "He's strong," Kane would say, "or she is. Going to be a fighter, this one." "Just like his or her mother," Kenneth said with approval. "Takes a fighter to do what Elena did, to run away and start over." Elena thought about that sometimes, about the girl she'd been just 7 months ago, hiding in a cattle car and terrified for her life. She hardly recognized that person anymore. That Elena had been broken and scared and convinced she had no future. This Elena was loved and valued and building a life more beautiful than she'd ever imagined. She thought about Silas Garrett sometimes too, though less and less as the months passed. True to his word, he hadn't returned to the Broken Arrow. Whether he'd given up or was simply biding his time, Elena didn't know, but she was no longer afraid of him. She was Elena Fletcher now, wife of Kane Fletcher, daughter-in-law of Kenneth Fletcher, future mother to a Fletcher child. She had a family and a home and a purpose. Silas couldn't touch that, no matter how much money or influence he had. The baby came in late May, on a warm spring morning when the valley was green and the wildflowers were blooming. Elena's labor started just before dawn, and by the time the sun was fully up, Kenneth had sent for the doctor from town and Mrs. Paulson, who'd helped with many births over the years. Kane refused to leave Elena's side, holding her hand through the contractions, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, whispering encouragement even when Elena was cursing him for putting her through this. "I'm never doing this again," she gasped between contractions. "Whatever you want," Kane said, looking terrified. "Just please be all right." "She's doing fine," Mrs. Paulson said calmly. "First babies take their time, but everything's progressing normally. You're doing great, Elena." It was late afternoon when the baby finally came, slipping into the world with a lusty cry that made Elena laugh even through her exhaustion. Mrs. Paulson cleaned the baby quickly and wrapped it in a soft blanket before placing it in Elena's arms. "A boy," she announced. "A healthy, strong boy." Elena looked down at her son, this tiny, perfect human she and Kane had created, and felt her heart overflow. He had a shock of dark hair like hers, and when he opened his eyes, she could already see they'd be amber like Kane's. Kane was crying, she realized, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. "He's perfect," Kane whispered. "Elena, he's absolutely perfect." "Do you want to hold him?" Elena asked. Kane took the baby with trembling hands, cradling him carefully like he was made of glass. "Hello, little man," he said softly. "I'm your papa. I've been waiting to meet you." Kenneth appeared in the doorway, having been banished during the actual birth but clearly unable to stay away any longer. When he saw his grandson, his weathered face crumpled with emotion. "Come meet your grandfather," Kane said, moving to let Kenneth see better. Kenneth reached out one calloused finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. The baby immediately grasped it, his grip surprisingly strong, and Kenneth let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "He's a Fletcher all right," Kenneth said. "Got the grip for it." "What are you going to name him?" Mrs. Paulson asked, tidying up the room. Kane looked at Elena, who nodded. They'd discussed this already, though they'd kept it secret. "Kenneth," Kane said, looking at his father. "Kenneth Fletcher, Jr., if that's all right with you, Father." Kenneth's eyes went wide. "You're naming him after me. You built this ranch, this life," Kane said. "You took Elena in when she had nowhere to go. You gave us your blessing and your support. It seems right that our son carry your name." Kenneth had to turn away for a moment, clearly overcome. When he turned back, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "It's an honor," he said gruffly. "A real honor, thank you." Little Kenneth, who would quickly become known as Kenny to differentiate him from his grandfather, proved to be an easy baby. He ate well, slept reasonably well, and seemed content to be passed around between his doting father, grandfather, and the various ranch hands who all considered themselves honorary uncles. Elena recovered quickly from the birth, and fell into the rhythms of motherhood with the same determination she'd brought to everything else in her new life. She loved nursing her son, loved the quiet moments in the rocking chair Kane had made for her, loved watching Kane interact with their child with such tenderness and joy. That summer was one of the happiest of Elena's life. The ranch thrived, the cattle were healthy, the weather was good, and her little family was growing and flourishing. It was in late August, when Kenny was 3 months old, that Silas Garrett reappeared. Elena was in the garden behind the house, Kenny sleeping in a basket beside her, when she heard a horse approach. She looked up and felt her heart stop. Silas sat atop his black horse, looking down at her with cold eyes. He'd aged in the past year, Elena thought. There were new lines around his mouth and his hair was grayer than she remembered. "Elena," he said, his voice flat. "Or I suppose it's Mrs. Fletcher now." Elena stood up slowly, positioning herself between Silas and her baby. "What are you doing here? I wanted to see for myself if the rumors were true, that you'd married some cowboy foreman and were playing house on this little ranch." His eyes drifted to the basket. "And had a baby, I see. How domestic." "You need to leave," Elena said, keeping her voice steady even though her heart was racing. "You have no business here." "On the contrary, I have a great deal of business here," Silas said. He dismounted, moving toward her with deliberate slowness. "You see, I've spent the last year trying to recoup the losses your little escape caused me. The money I paid your uncle, the humiliation of being stood up at my own wedding, the business deals that fell through because people questioned my judgment. It's been expensive, Elena, in more ways than one." "That's not my problem," Elena said, backing up slightly as Silas advanced. "I never agreed to marry you. Any agreements you made with my uncle were between the two of you." "Your uncle is dead," Silas said flatly. Elena felt the world tilt. "What? He died 3 months ago." "A heart attack or so, they said. Left a mountain of debts, which means there's no one to recoup my money from, which leaves you." "I don't have your money," Elena said. "I don't have anything." "No, but your husband does. This ranch must be worth something. And that's a valuable baby you have there. Fletcher's heir, I'm guessing." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Elena felt rage rise up to replace the fear. "If you touch my child, I'll kill you myself." Silas laughed, a harsh sound. "You always did have spirit. That's what attracted me to you in the first place, that fire. I planned to break it out of you eventually, but it would have been enjoyable trying." "Get off this property," Elena said. "Now. Or what? You'll scream for your husband. I saw him ride out with the other men an hour ago." "You're alone here, Elena, except for that baby. How quickly do you think help could arrive if something were to happen?" Silas took another step toward her, and Elena's hand flew to her pocket. She'd started carrying a small knife there after Kenny was born, some instinct telling her to be prepared. Her fingers closed around the handle. "I'm not the helpless girl I was a year ago," Elena said quietly. "I won't run anymore, and I won't let you threaten my child." Silas's expression hardened. "You think you can stand against me? You're nobody, Elena. A runaway orphan who lucked into a marriage with a foreman. Do you really think this life is permanent? Do you think it can't all be taken away? I think you should listen to the lady and leave." The voice came from behind Silas, and Elena looked past him to see Kane standing at the corner of the house. His hand rested on the pistol at his hip, and his face was set in hard lines. Silas turned slowly. "The husband! How convenient!" "I said leave," Kane repeated. "You're trespassing on my family's property, and you're threatening my wife and child. That gives me every right to shoot you where you stand." "Would you? Would you really commit murder?" Silas asked. "It wouldn't be murder," Kenneth's voice said from the other side. Elena saw Kane's father emerge from the barn, carrying a rifle. "It would be defending my family from a threat. And there are plenty of witnesses who heard you threaten Mrs. Fletcher and her baby." Elena looked around and saw that all the ranch hands had appeared, seemingly from nowhere, forming a loose circle around Silas. Every one of them was armed. Silas finally seemed to realize he was beaten. The cold calculation that had driven him all this time flickered in his eyes as he assessed the situation and found no way to win. "This isn't over," he said, but the threat rang hollow now. "Yes, it is," Kane said firmly. He'd moved to stand beside Elena, one arm around her, the other still near his gun. "You have no claim on my wife. You have no right to be here. And if you set foot on Broken Arrow land again, or if you make any attempt to contact Elena or anyone in my family, I will hunt you down." "That's not a threat, Garrett. That's a promise." For a long moment, Silas just stared at them. Then his gaze dropped to the basket where Kenny was starting to fuss, awakened by the commotion. Something shifted in Silas's expression, something that might have been envy or regret or just bitter resignation. "You're welcome to her," Silas finally said. "She was always too much trouble anyway." He turned and walked back to his horse, mounting with stiff dignity. Before he rode away, he looked back one last time. "I hope it was worth it," he said to Elena, "throwing away everything for this." "It was," Elena said without hesitation. "This is everything." Silas rode away, and this time Elena knew he wouldn't be back. There was a finality to his departure, a severing of whatever twisted connection had bound them through her uncle's greed and his own arrogance. As soon as Silas was out of sight, Elena's knees buckled. Kane caught her, holding her tight while she shook with reaction. "It's over," Kane murmured into her hair. "It's really over now." "How did you know?" Elena managed to ask. "I thought you'd ridden out." "We had," Kane said, "but Ray's horse threw a shoe about a mile out. We turned back and I saw Garrett's horse tied outside. I knew immediately what was happening." "He's right, though," Elena said, pulling back to look at Kane's face. "I brought this trouble to your door. I put all of you in danger." "And we'd do it again," Kenneth said firmly, coming over to rest a hand on Elena's shoulder. "Your family. That means something here." The other ranch hands nodded agreement, and Hank said, "Besides, watching that pompous fool realize he was outnumbered was the most entertainment I've had all month." Despite everything, Elena found herself laughing. These men, this place, this family, they'd saved her in every way possible. They'd given her safety and purpose and love and a future. They'd stood between her and a man who would have destroyed her, not once but twice now. Kenny started crying in earnest now, and Elena picked him up, holding him close. Kane wrapped his arms around both of them, and Elena leaned into his strength. "Let's go inside," Kane said quietly. "I think we've had enough excitement for one day." That night, after Kenny was asleep and the house was quiet, Kane held Elena close in their bed. "I need you to know something," he said. "When I saw Garrett threatening you today, I was prepared to kill him. I would have done it without hesitation if he'd made one wrong move." "I know," Elena said softly. "Does that scare you?" Elena thought about it, then shook her head. "No, because I know you would only do something like that to protect the people you love. There's a difference between violence for its own sake and violence in defense of family." "You're stronger than I gave you credit for," Kane said. "The way you stood up to him, even knowing you were alone, the way you put yourself between him and Kenny. You're fierce, Elena Fletcher." "I'm a mother now," Elena said simply, "and a wife. I have something worth fighting for." "That makes all the difference." Kane kissed her forehead. "I love you more every day." "I love you too," Elena whispered back. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for giving me this life." "Thank you for running to me," Kane said. "Best decision I ever made was helping you out of that cattle car." Elena thought back to that day, to the terrified girl hiding among the cattle, convinced she had no future. If someone had told her then that in a year she'd be married to a wonderful man, living on a beautiful ranch, mother to a perfect baby boy, she never would have believed it. But here she was, living a life more beautiful than any dream. The years that followed were good ones for the Fletcher family. The ranch continued to prosper under Kenneth and Kane's careful management. Elena became known throughout the territory for her cooking, and the Broken Arrow developed a reputation as the best place to work because of the quality of the food alone. Kenny grew into a sturdy, happy toddler with his father's amber eyes and his mother's dark hair. He was doted on by everyone on the ranch, learning to ride almost before he could walk, trailing after Cain whenever he was allowed. When Kenny was 2, Elena became pregnant again. This time Cain was slightly less panicked during the birth, though he still refused to leave her side. Their second child was a daughter, born on a cold December morning. They named her Margaret, after Cain's mother, and called her Maggie. Maggie had her father's stubborn streak and her mother's determination. By the time she was 3, she was already insisting on helping with the horses and refused to wear dresses if she could get away with it. Kenneth adored his granddaughter, and she wrapped him around her little finger with ease. 2 years after Maggie came another boy, Samuel, named for the young ranch hand who'd become like a brother to Cain. Samuel was quieter than his siblings, more thoughtful, and showed an early aptitude for numbers that made Elena predict he'd be handling the ranch accounts someday. Elena's life was full and busy and sometimes exhausting, but she wouldn't have changed a single thing. She loved her children, loved her husband, loved the ranch and the life they'd built together. Kenneth aged gracefully, growing silver-haired but staying strong and active well into his 60s. He watched his grandchildren grow with obvious pride, often telling Elena that she'd brought new life to the ranch in more ways than one. "You saved Cain," he told her once when she was heavy with her 4th pregnancy. After his brother left and his mother died, he got so serious. "All work, no joy, but you brought the joy back. You reminded him what he was working for." "He saved me first," Elena pointed out. "I was the one hiding in a cattle car with no hope." "You saved each other," Kenneth said wisely. "That's what the best marriages do." Elena never heard from or about Silas Garrett again after that day in the garden. She liked to imagine that he'd moved on, found some other life, maybe even found some measure of peace. But mostly, she didn't think about him at all. That part of her life was closed, finished, no longer relevant to who she was. Sometimes, though, usually late at night when she couldn't sleep, Elena would slip out of bed and walk through the quiet house. She'd check on each of her sleeping children, marveling at their peaceful faces. She'd stand in the kitchen where she'd cooked thousands of meals, feeling the familiar weight of home and belonging. She'd step out onto the porch and look up at the stars, brilliant and countless over the high desert. And she'd remember that day in the cattle car, hiding among the restless cattle, terrified and desperate. She'd remember the sound of the door opening, the silhouette of a cowboy standing against the bright morning sun. She'd remember his voice asking if she planned to ride all the way to the slaughterhouse, remember the warmth of his hand as he'd led her to safety. "Run to me instead," he'd essentially said, though those hadn't been his exact words. But that's what he'd offered her that day and every day since. A place to run to, a home to run toward, arms to run into. One evening when Elena was in her mid-30s, and Kenny was preparing to take over more of the ranch management, Cain found her standing on the porch, lost in thought. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How lucky I am," Elena said honestly. "How different my life could have been if you hadn't found me that day." "How different both our lives would have been," Cain corrected. "I wasn't really living before you came along. I was just existing, going through the motions." "We saved each other," Elena said, echoing what Kenneth had told her years ago. "We did," Cain agreed. "Best thing I ever did was help you out of that cattle car and bring you home." "Best thing I ever did was accept your help," Elena said. She turned in his arms to face him. "I love you, Cain Fletcher, today and always." "Today and always," Cain echoed, and kissed her as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow. Kenneth died peacefully in his sleep when he was 68, surrounded by his family. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch he'd loved so much, and Elena planted wildflowers on his grave that bloomed every spring. Kenny married a smart, capable young woman from town named Catherine, and they had children of their own, continuing the Fletcher line. Maggie, true to form, fell in love with a horse trainer from Colorado and moved away, though she visited often with her growing family. Samuel did indeed take over the ranch accounts, and proved to have a head for business that took the Broken Arrow to new levels of success. Elena and Cain's fourth child, a daughter they named Rose, stayed closest to home, eventually marrying one of the ranch hands and living in a house built just over the rise from the main ranch. Elena grew older gracefully, her dark hair silvering, her face lining with age and laughter. But her strength never faded, her spirit never dimmed. She was the heart of the Broken Arrow, the one everyone came to for advice or comfort or just a good meal and a sympathetic ear. Cain stayed by her side through all of it, growing older alongside her, their love deepening with every passing year. They'd weathered challenges together, drought years that threatened the cattle, hard winters that tested everyone's endurance, the normal trials of raising children and running a ranch. But they'd weathered it all together, their partnership solid and true. When Elena was 53, Cain 61, they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with all their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch. It was a warm September evening, and the whole valley seemed to glow in the golden autumn light. After dinner, after the cake was eaten and the grandchildren were running around playing games, Cain took Elena's hand and led her away from the crowd, out to the spot where they'd first stopped on that long-ago day when he'd found her in the cattle car. "I wanted to come back here," Cain said. "To where it all started." The creek still burbled over the rocks, and the cottonwood trees were golden with fall. It looked almost exactly as it had that day 25 years ago, and yet everything was different. "I was so scared that day," Elena remembered. "Exhausted and terrified and convinced I'd never be safe again. And I was so determined to help you," Cain said. "I saw you in that cattle car and something in me just knew you were important, that you were going to change everything." "I did change everything," Elena said with a smile. "I made you actually take days off occasionally," Cain laughed. "You did more than that. You gave me a life worth living. You gave me children and grandchildren and a reason to build something lasting. You gave me love, Elena. Real love, the kind that grows stronger instead of fading." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "You gave me all of that too, and you gave me something I'd lost, hope. When you held out your hand to me that day when you said to follow you, you gave me hope that life could be good again, and it has been. It's been more than good, it's been beautiful." Cain pulled her close, and they stood there together as the sun set, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built a life that neither of them could have imagined alone. "I love you," Cain said. "Today and always." "Today and always," Elena echoed, and kissed her husband as the stars began to appear overhead. They lived another 23 years together after that, Cain passing away peacefully at 84 with Elena holding his hand, Elena following him just 2 years later at 76. They were buried side by side on the hill next to Kenneth, overlooking the ranch that had been their home and their legacy. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren continued the traditions they'd established, running the Broken Arrow with the same dedication and love that Cain and Kenneth had shown. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, the family would gather and ask the older ones to tell the story again. The story of how Elena Fletcher had hidden on a cattle train running away from a life that would have destroyed her. How a young cowboy named Cain had found her, and instead of turning her away, had offered her everything: safety, home, family, love. How he'd essentially said, "Run to me instead," and she had, and it had made all the difference. It was a love story for the ages, the kind that got passed down through generations. A reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us exactly where we're meant to be. That sometimes running away is the bravest thing we can do. And that sometimes, if we're very lucky, someone will be there to catch us when we fall and show us what real love looks like. Elena Foster, who became Elena Fletcher, who built a life and a family and a legacy that lasted long after she was gone, would have smiled to know her story was still being told. Because it was a good story, a true story, and one that proved that even in the hardest times, love could win. And it did win in the end. It won everything.